Hallo.
Hello, dear guests of Republica. I'm very happy to be in a hall with such a large audience. And so we're going to talk about civil society now and about the worldwide rise of right-wing extremism and the polarizing effects that come with that. And it's an important question. Attacks on civil society are a mass phenomenon. There's the Atlas of Civil Society created by Bread for the World. And we still have last year's numbers. 2% of the world population live in countries with an open civil society, meaning where there's no sort of repression going on. Germany was downgraded 3 years ago, also because of the harsh attacks on climate activists. And in this session today, we want to focus on the question, what civil society itself and what politics can do by increasing resiliency to these attacks and also to have a more efficiency in their role that they play in liberal democracy. And we do that in this talk with these four great experts up here on stage. Astrid Dahlmann is head of Campact. We have Luisa Neubauer, a climate activist from Fridays for Future and author. Saba Nushima works at the Goethe University in Frankfurt and also writes various texts. And then we have Markus Beckedahl, founder of the Center for Digital Rights and Democracy. So please give a warm welcome to our four guests up on stage. So I think everyone who's responsible for hosting a session at Republica, you ask the question: how can you get the maximum effect from that, so that the audience will leave at the end and say, "Wow, this was really worth it." And so we've got 3 focus points today, and these 3 focus points. The first one is look at the status quo of civil society in Germany. What do we have to think about, when we talk about civil society in Germany right now? And then the second focus point that we want to expound on is sort of this relationship problem, is what I would call them. So conservative parties, for example, the CDU, CSU, we want to zoom in and, really look at what's the problem here between civil society and the conservative parties. What can we change about that in order to have a better relationship? And then the third point is to have our 4 experts up on stage to give concrete, specific tips. What can people do? What can organizations do to increase resiliency? And what are our ideas, or what do we want, from the new German government in order to make civil society better? So those are 3 focus points, and we hope you can take away something from that. And so let's start with looking at the status quo. The question that I'd like to pose to each and every one of you is, how would you describe the state of organized civil society in Germany? And so, don't repeat what was just said, but just add to it when you have something to add. And so I want to give you a few keywords up front. You don't have to use them, but you may use them in order to give the audience an idea of, oh yeah, that's something that we could, look at when we talk about this huge picture of civil society. Diversity, attacks, self-censorship, efficiency, self-criticism, regional differences, the ability to form alliances, and XYZ differences between generations. And again, it's not about covering all these topics, but to look at this topic from different perspectives. Astrid, do you want to start? Yeah, so I'm going to try. Civil society, it's a very broad topic. It's very diverse. We have like 650,000, 800,000 various forms of, associations in Germany that voluntarily do something, that are non-profits, that are trying to bring something to society. And no one wants to buy like a golden bike at the end of the year, but it's really about achieving their mission and about achieving certain goals. And it's not specifically regulated in Germany. And so why we encounter these attacks is because a lot of people in politics, they really struggle with the fact that people voluntarily go on the street, they articulate their needs, they articulate the need for change, that they don't like something in the status quo. That's something people in politics can't grasp. And so civil societies, it needs funding, right? And they don't have a lot of money. And so you always have to keep filling out these forms in order to get funding, and your funding might run out at any time. And there's also a taxation matter, which means that your local tax authority decides on whether an organization is doing something for the public good, is a nonprofit. And so these offices have, lists of what might be considered non-profit. And so, for example, political education isn't on that list, or social topics aren't on that list. And so that leads to lots and lots of organizations in Germany who really think twice about making statements on day-to-day news and political events, because they're really afraid of these offices looking at their actions and denying them the nonprofit status. And so, that's really, really bad that a lot of people don't know that nonprofit status in Germany is this taxation matter. It's not about content. And so getting money from foundations, you only get those when you're a nonprofit. And so this mixture, leads to some form of self-censorship, or at least, you don't want to be out in the spotlight. You want to stay back a little bit. And so, we're all facing the same storm, but we're sitting in different boats. And so it's very, very important to to act out solidarity with each other, because, that's the status. To have this fear of what will my organization survive the next day, the next year. Who wants to continue? To add to it, I think it's quite a new situation, right? To this insecurity when it comes to your legal status, that certain actors, they found out that to do these campaigns, right, to targeting foundations or pressuring tax offices into feeling the need to act, or at least simulate an action. And quite often, I think, the withdrawing nonprofit status, I think, like a few years ago, there wasn't a question of can Greenpeace, call a large gathering, a protest somewhere. But now that's a question that's actually being raised. And so I think we've seen that in various countries around the world, that targeting the nonprofit status is the first step in, getting rid of your enemies that are protecting human rights. And so, yeah, I think that's now happening in Germany as well. And so with a digital civil society here, right? And I think we can also say that we've never had such a diverse digital civil society as we do now in Germany. So many organizations, networks, people that show that you can have infrastructure for the public good, that and share knowledge, and that works, and that's something beautiful, because sometimes it even works without funding, because people just believe in the common good and want to work together for that. Yeah, so I agree, and I think, yeah, that the modernization of this non-profit law, it's really something we need. It was something that the former government tried to do, and so it's out of the question that we need to change there. And on the other hand, I think we also have to think about how does civil society work. You just mentioned like non-profits, but it's not an NGO, for example, Greenpeace, but because they really depend on public money. And so I think that's something we can see right now, that these symbolic attacks, these 551 questions that were posed by the Conservative Party, basically questioning, is it still legitimate for these organizations to still receive public money and public funding? And of course, there was the vote that the CDU took together with the AfD, and I think that really shows where we're at right now. And so right now, I think we're in the phase, how do we defend liberal democracy? Because the attacks have already happened. And so to zoom out a little bit, I think that's something we see in the US for some weeks, for some years, in Hungary, in Austria, where progressive civil society is pressured more and more, targeted more and more. And so when we look within in Germany, what sort of structures do we have? Where do we have? So, for example, a law to increase understanding of democracy was also promised by the last coalition, but didn't come into action. And so I think there's this global development where authoritarian regimes and attacks on democratic civil society, it's just regular praxis, and it happens every day. And so, yeah, we don't have to do that today, but while you two were talking, civil society can also be destructive, right? When we look at research on civil society, civil society also took, part in establishing fascist regimes sometimes. And so we also have to define what do we mean by civil society when we talk about it right now. And so my last point may be what we don't talk about that much in public debates, is hope or emotion maybe in the situation that we're in right now. The rise of authoritarian right-wing parties, where does that come from? What does that relate to? These, crushed hopes, and maybe that also, what was promised to civil societies, what civil society did. Maybe we can look at it later on, where stuff went wrong, where mistakes were made. So, for example, the former German government, but especially in political education, what were the mistakes being made there? Yeah, so That was quite friendly of all of you, but maybe we can state the obvious. The right-wing AfD, is on the rise. And so what's the first thing that the new German government made is to call into question the trust into German civil society, which is a catastrophe. And they frenetically tried to deny what they did, but they tried to, play it off as sort of just taxation matter. But really, I think these explanations are lacking because the mistrust of our parties into civil society, and they also talk about like the role of the church or who's like a left-wing maniac. And so when they then declare that you don't need democratic education as a reason for why you need to probe civil society, it's sort of so destabilizing to the model we're living in, to why do we have a civil society in a strong and liberal democracy. And then, we have these repressions that you mentioned, structural repressions. And of course, in the last few years, we've noticed that, police and right to hold protests, lots and lots of barriers to do that. And so, for example, the climate strike events, they're being done by young people, right? And so then were these laws being passed that required quite a few adults to be behind those gatherings. And we saw that in North Rhine-Westphalia, where, specific parts of our events were being targeted. But also there's the large-scale part of people who are discriminated against anyway, so minorities, women, who are dually attacked by attacks from right-wing people and from political measures done by the government. And so, because you mentioned it earlier, I think at this point we also, need to acknowledge that Germany was downranked when it comes to civil society, because lots and lots of events in solidarity with the people in Gaza were being targeted, where I think really our fundamental understanding of peaceful protest has been called into question. And so how do we defend ourselves? How do we protect ourselves? But at the same time, look at that we're in this fight over what does civil society actually mean. And I think there's a stark disagreement, between lots and lots of people in this country and the government.
Yeah, and so that's exactly the type of dissent that we want to have a look at, just to put it out there. Personally, I'm absolutely convinced that the fight against anti-democratic hate can only happen and can only succeed within the democratic spectrum of politics. And while we spend the majority of our time kind of repressing each other, we are actually strengthening our actual enemies. So I think it's really important while we do this quick deep dive, and I still don't have good words for this tension between parts of civil society and especially the conservative parties, conservative parties in Germany, because I also don't want to do this by pointing the finger at certain groups and saying, that's impossible, but rather I think we should look forward and figure out how to do this better and to kind of relieve this tension. That's kind of part of the goal of this exercise. You already mentioned, Sana, you mentioned two things, the law for the support of democracy. That's something that was prevented under the last government by the conservative parties. One of the main points of tension was the clause regarding the extremism clause. And one thing that I kept hearing also when I spoke to people on background was something people were concerned about the lack of neutrality by parts of civil society. To maybe put it slightly polemically, essentially this belief that progressive parties, especially the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, just want to support their own cheerleaders financially with this law. And then one day after the last federal election, this claim was essentially further buttressed by this list of 551 questions, which was kind of when there was that one question, Buxtehude. Yeah, so in Buxtehude, there's an organization that got 18,000 euros over the last 5 years. Oh, yeah, I mean, that's terrible. And to just focus on the other side, parts of civil society repeatedly run actions and put out slogans that oppose the quote-unquote right. And there are conservative parties and members of the conservative spectrum that feel attacked by that because they say, I am right-wing, but what is meant is right-wing populism, far-right extremism. And so my question is for all of you, do you think there is something wrong here? And if yes, what's the cause of that? And then the most important question is probably, what do we demand? Like, what kinds of demands do we have both for organized civil society and for parts of the conservative parties, which obviously are also not monoliths, to relieve this tension a little bit and to really make sure that we are all clear on who the real enemies are. So, I mean, just to begin with, I find it very funny when conservative parties complain that we are against them, because if they had asked their more progressive colleagues, I don't think I don't think there are any progressive parties that believe that civil society doesn't criticize them. So, I mean, we are happy to criticize generously across the political spectrum. I think you're correct in the analysis that there is a deep mistrust between conservative parties who like to kind of put this left-wing politics stamp on any kind of protest. It was especially bizarre in the recent past where I really put a lot of work into Michael Friedman standing on the stage with me. So it's not about us versus them, but it's about having like a firewall against the far right. And if even Angela Merkel says that she doesn't like that so much, like something is deeply wrong there in terms of how we are assessing these things. We need obviously there's a thing with progressive civil society coming together here, but they really try to bring members of the Conservative Party to go into the street with them. And if I was a Conservative Party member, I would be extremely humbled and say, oh, but then we need to make that possible. But if then in their own politics, they can't, like, they just don't have any other ideas except for simply dismissing all protest as left-wing, I mean, that's not, like, then we're not the problem. I mean, but not everyone does that, right? I remember one of the large demonstrations 1 or 2 years ago in Münster where the mayor, great guy, who's managed to keep the AfD below 5%, who wasn't invited. And he wasn't invited to speak on the stage. He was actually, in fact, actively disinvited by the organizers. But he said, but I actually still want to join. I want to be part of this protest. Oh, but he can do that. Well, I mean, that's obviously the right of civil society who you want to invite, and you do. Are we having an event where we're inviting politicians? I mean, I think that's a bit like, but I think that's part, like, maybe the source of this kind of mistrust. But isn't it the job of, okay, if I want to run a government, if I want to govern a country, then I need to have the self-confidence and self-reflection to recognize that I do not also get to decide which politicians get to speak on a stage at an event that's organized by civil society. And I mean, in this case, I wasn't involved in this, but if the organizers don't think that it's a good fit, then, I mean, personally, I would be embarrassed to complain that I don't get to make a speech. If there's anything that he really absolutely wants to say, then he can give an interview somewhere else. But let's be honest, the job of civil society is to curate something that wouldn't happen in politics, and to maybe open up debates and bring in perspectives that are not present in every parliamentary debate, and especially when it comes to parties who kind of always emphasize the importance of respect. Then especially from them, I would expect kind of the generousness to be perfectly fine with that. Astrid, do you want to react immediately? Yeah, I would like to extend that immediately. I don't want to comment on this whole Mr. thing at all. I want to focus our attention on something else, which is kind of the systemic system or the systems behind this, where it's not just about, we need to do lots of things completely differently. Just to begin with, if I just look at the last 6 to 8 months, the things that happened. So we had early elections, and there was a systematic hate campaign against many people in civil society. At least for Campact, I can say we have never had to sue to go up against so many fake claims about us as since October last year, but not every organization can, and we do win in court, and not every organization can afford that. And we're not being funded by the state, right? So we are funded publicly, and that's also something that the bureaus of the politicians, Mr. Dobrindt and Mr. Merz, know, who have signed this small inquiry in Parliament. They know that. This is about something else. It's about sowing doubt because they cannot contain us. And if, as the Conservative Party under Friedrich Merz, if I get it into my head to have something also supported by the far-right AfD in Parliament, and then people go into the street and protest against it, then it's absolutely not helpful to pretend, to just pretend that. So the thing that they really need to understand, it's civil society, or at least parts of civil society that are not comfortable for the Conservative Party under Friedrich Merz. And that's a systematic strategy. They want to delegitimize these parts of civil society that are not comfortable for them. And it is absolutely the case. Some people claim we don't want to talk to people from the Conservative Party. That's absolutely not true. We're happy to meet with those that are happy to meet with us. But many of them refuse to meet with us in the first place because they just pretend that we are left-wing maniacs. And if I delegitimize these organizations, then I'm also make it easy for my voters and for my political base to just refuse to engage. You already mentioned in your first statement in the very beginning, you mentioned the keywords authoritarian playbooks. The delegitimization of civil society, of science, of media is part of this playbook. That's something we need to understand in the first place. And then I think after that, we can talk about how to prevent and how to solve this. But I don't think the first question is to ask what we are doing to cause or support that. We really need to ask in the first place, what's the systematic strategy behind this? Okay, so you got applause for that. So yeah, maybe that's there's going to be an uncomfortable answer to that. I agree with the analysis. I don't know if we have enough time to do the analysis first and understand what the authoritarian playbook is, and then we figure out how to defend ourselves against that, because that's how I started. We don't have the time for that. We are already in the middle of this crisis. So maybe just to start with, right? Sometimes you have a demonstration against the right, and you immediately get complaints. Obviously, it's also supposed to slow down campaigns. It's supposed to hinder this educational work, and that works very well. But in times where the head of the AfD describes Hitler as left-wing, we can also ask, can we just not do this part? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm not saying that we need to do this, but isn't it possible to also frame certain things differently, not because we follow their logic, but because we have our own logic and we have values that we stand for? Of course, I can decide that if there's a demonstration and a march against the far right, what are the values that I'm on the street for? What does it mean? Like, what do human rights mean very concretely, very specifically? You mentioned the protests pro-Palestine. Of course, you can make every protest very concrete and very specific, but the question is whether you want to do that. And in those cases, I don't think it's a capitulation faced with far-right strategies, but I do think it's like a strategy to counter it or to deal with it. And what I mentioned earlier when it comes to the analysis, where it's about understanding the playbook, I think absolutely, but I think part of that, that's also where I think we need to maybe have a bit more self-reflection, like how did we end up here? How can it be that we are at a point right now where like 20% of voters voted the AfD, and there are many who are happy to vote for conservative positions. But I would say like at least half of society are fine with this. They're happy with progressive positions not being top of the agenda. How did that happen? How did we get here? What happened in the last few years? And I think here too, I would definitely put myself in, like, say that I'm part of the progressive left, and I think we have to question what happened, like what went wrong in left-wing politics in the last few years. There's an enormous fight for jobs, for apartments. There's an enormous shortage, but how did we get here? So it's not it doesn't necessarily mean that people who are disappointed vote for the far right. So there's not necessarily causality, but it's important to just state to begin with, there's like a deep disappointment and a deep lack of trust and deep loss of trust when it comes to democratic institutions. I would say that's at least 50% of the population. And how do we deal with this lack of trust, this loss of trust? And how did that happen in the 21st century? Because we were used to things getting better, to things developing, and I mean, this is like the most superficial analysis ever, but many, especially in the working class, like it has changed, it has diversified. Yeah, so for many people, we can talk about educational improvements, but there is a huge gap. There are many people who are not being seen. They have this feeling of being missed. And many people are still marginalized in marginalized positions, especially, like, for example, POC and others. And just because, I mean, obviously, being a POC, being marginalized yourself doesn't mean that you can't vote, that you won't vote for the far right. We've known that. And how do we even get there? And I think this kind of analysis can help to develop counter strategies. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you on the analysis, but I think we should also look more into this question of what the conservative camp even implies or encompasses. It's not a monolith. It includes very liberally thinking, like, convinced Democrats who, all the way to people who want something other than democracy, but who still vote for the Conservative Party. As the progressive camp in the past, we might have more in common with these liberal Democrats in the Conservative Party than with their anti-democratic colleagues. And I think the things that we have in common is fighting for these common values of democracy. And I think the challenge for us is how to essentially activate these different parts of the democratic spectrum. And I think that's a challenge in terms of language, because we need to bring these, like, different cultures together. But the main danger is that we lose these camps to the other side who are also trying to win them over. Where there's all these rage influencers who keep pouring oil into the fire to essentially further and further expand and strengthen this anti-democratic part of the conservative camp to go up against us. And I think we need to learn to listen to each other. We need to learn to speak a common language, because this is about our democracy, and this is something we share and something we should not lose.
Ja, und?
Yes, and you just made the point. It's so interesting, because really it's a sort of like children's question. Who started it? And so looking at it from a climate activist perspective, I think for large parts of the climate movement in Germany, I can say that, we never wanted this to be a progressive project. From the beginning, it was clear it has to be, include all sorts of parties. And the first political talk I had back then was with Peter Altmaier. And it was so clear we have to win over the conservatives. So, even try to convince Christian Lindner. Part of my life that I look on fondly. It needs to be, come just from democracy, from the whole party spectrum. And we've talked so much with industry and lobby groups from the various industries. And there was this phase where it was totally clear to us as activists, we have to be everywhere. We have to talk to everyone. It doesn't have to be me specifically, but representatives of the climate movement and I think it really was, I was on the talk show of Markus Lanz with Friedrich Merz back then, and there really was an interest also from these various political actors in our movement, in our cause. And something changed drastically. And so I don't think it was suddenly we were standing on the streets and being like, oh, we really don't like Friedrich Merz anymore. Because that wasn't us. What happened was that we were climate activists and suddenly we were being perceived as left-wing activists. And then, also these sorts of political measures of repression started, and these videos of police action and activism also changed. We have the last generation, and of course that changed a lot. But when we talk about, who drifted apart from whom, I think we should be very careful to have this sort of one-dimensional picture of, well, the leftist people went even further left-wing, and the conservatives just stayed in the middle. And of course we saw that, political progressive parties profit from climate topics being talked about during an election cycle. But I think really, we have to talk with people. We have to, have civil society. Civil society must not be a leftist project. But we also have to talk honestly about what is happening right now and where these changes are coming from and who's responsible for that. And so, last sentence. And if we talk about this right now, what does that mean for us as civil society actors? I think, Markus, what you said was really great, to look at this divisive character. So if now all the climate topics are suddenly left-wing, that really, spells trouble for people who don't think of themselves as leftist, but care about the climate. And so I think a lot of people, for example, firefighters, people who volunteer in churches, this this categorization that's happening right now. These people suddenly need to decide what they want to be seen as. And so I think there's lots and lots of goodwill that should come from politics in that regard. And I really, want to disagree when it comes to this question of language, because it's really about keeping in mind who do we do this for. And so the most stable anti-fascist club that we have right now in Germany is Omas gegen rechts, grandmas against right. And then conservative parties, feel like mistreated by the name of this organization. And that's, I think, we really need to take a stand and not budge, not give in, because we really had lots and lots of negative experiences when it comes to climate. When people come up to me and be like, ooh, the term climate is a trigger word for me, then I really think, well, you shouldn't be in politics. You shouldn't have any responsibility in politics. And so, I think that's something, where people can actually be held accountable and where people have the capacity to deal with that. 100% agreement. And when we talk about language, we also talk about that there's this reframing going on. So civil society is a trigger word for conservatives at the moment. The so-called civil society, as it's known. And so there's this dark undertone, right? That's funded from outsiders or from the political enemies. And that leads to not having any sort of engagement, not having political discussions, not talking with each other, and not looking at the actual political views that they share. And so I want to mention something, a survey from the end of 23 from CVZ. It's a regular survey, and 30,000 associations stated that they are afraid to make political statements. And I feel like that's the middle, right, that we want to reach. So how did and when did civil society turn into this left-wing thing? And that's the reframing that we're in right now. And we don't have time for analysis, but I think we should keep in mind that that's the starting point from which we have to think about what to do right now. And the most important thing for me is, it sounds so lame because it's such an overused term, but we need solidarity with each other within civil society. When one of us is attacked, civil society as a whole is attacked. That's an understanding that we need. And then when I say this sounds sort of leftist, right? But we need collective resistance. And what I mean by that is that we pay attention to, for example, if suddenly the keeping the law, regulating platforms, enforcing the DSA in a legal way, how is that censorship? And so what more do we need to understand what is happening right now? And once we reach a consensus regarding this, then we can find countermeasures, and that can't be silent. It needs to be loud and clear, and needs to be articulated in a language that people can understand, so that a lot of people can participate. And we need to show them how they can be effective as an individual or as part of an association. Lots of agreement within the audience. I also want to continue with a yes and. I wanted to try to, look at various aspects of this problem, right? So you've mentioned climate isn't supposed to be progressive. Why should that be leftist? And democracy as well. Democracy isn't a single-party project, but that's the whole point of it, right? Pluralism. And so when that is being framed as something left-wing, as something leftist, progressive, then that's the beginning of the end, I think. And for me, who works in a think tank and is responsible for the program of resilient democracy. It's really important for me, solidarity within civil society, right? Even within progressive civil society, there's different, topics that are being worked on. There's actors that talk about where authoritarian playbooks are put into action. And there are other actors who try to build bridges to conservative actors in the political sphere, and to try to work together and to try to, clearly. And so we need to clearly define the lines. Where does the democratic area end and the authoritarian area begin? And that's really important, I think. And to use the last time that we have on this panel, I want to talk about the third point that I mentioned up front, concrete calls to action, concrete tips. So there's so many people in this hall with us right now. Individuals or alliances, associations, so many various forms of people engaging within civil society. And so what can you actually tell them in order to build up resilience towards the agitation and attacks that civil society is facing right now, and to also have efficiency and to really have results in the work that they do. And at the end, we also want to have political results. So please, what can you tell them, the people in the audience right now?
Who wants to start? Astrid, maybe? Yeah, so I would like to highlight two initiatives that might be helpful for one or the other when you are in the situation where your nonprofit status is being attacked, or you need to do something against fake claims that are circulating about your organization. One is the Counter Wind Fund as part of the Amadeo Antonio Foundation. And the other organization is the Help Against Right, which is being organized by the GFF, Frag den Staat, and they support you with legal costs. They have specialized lawyers, and they have workshops, so you're not on your own when you end up in a situation like that. And I think that's helpful if you're suddenly in the eye of a storm. I think we need to realize that part of our infrastructure are running on servers of people that we cannot trust. And of course, it's comfortable and convenient, it's fun, and we're all on Instagram, even though we maybe don't really want to do it because the alternatives are don't work that well yet. But we need to start giving the alternatives a chance today, so we have better alternatives tomorrow, so we can switch together. I've always been impressed by Campact. You have 1 million email addresses that you can address directly. Many other organizations have really bet on their Facebook pages, and were totally surprised when Mark Zuckerberg suddenly changed their strategy overnight, and you just didn't have any reach anymore from one day to the next. And that's the reality, and we need to get away from that, and we need to have digital infrastructure oriented towards the public and the common good. And I think it's something that needs to be built up as at least part of political communication, because this kind of independent communication is something that we will still have if Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg decide from one day to the next that they won't enable us anymore. For example, there's very simple things like use Signal instead of WhatsApp, full stop. So I told my entire family I'm just not reachable via WhatsApp, and helped them install Signal, and so now all my 80-year-old aunts can communicate on Signal. So mobilize your aunts. I'm thinking about many different aspects right now, and I don't want to oppose or disagree with anything, but I feel like we're missing a kind of strategic preparation to defend democracy. I agree with many points, and it's nice, and I want to say, well, yeah, I think exactly the same, but maybe that's a different view, like a different perspective on reality. For example, when I speak to a friend who runs a civil society organization in East Germany, who just doesn't see any future anymore, or another friend who just started working in Brandenburg, like, I don't know, like how to, there are just realities there. I'm not sure this is about a reframing, like I said earlier, but I think we really need to recognize that we are in a phase that we have just never had before. And there are positions that might only be strategic positions. That's something that's also happened, that's occurred in the history of civil society over time. And just, for example, in the interest of certain shared values, so we can get back to those, because I really think we've lost a lot of that. Okay, I think I want to put out a warning. A lot of us have said that because we also, right, we said this is just the beginning, and I'm not saying that to be apocalyptic. I really think we need to be ready for the instruments that we've used to defend our democracy. You already mentioned platforms, legal possibilities. We spoke about different structures, but we've also spoken about trust. And I would really like to warn everyone that we underestimate what is happening right now, what it means when every fifth person in this country who votes is happy to vote far right or for a right-wing extremist party, what that means for these structures. We haven't even spoken about regional differences, about certain regions in Germany where civil society can basically not freely go out and state their opinion on the street freely anymore, where it's completely impossible to organize a Christopher Street Day, like a pride parade. And for example, like we all heard of cases where people might be like, oh, maybe we don't need a pride/rainbow flag in the countryside anymore. And I would like to warn everyone, we are all incredibly well informed about what Donald Trump did yesterday, but not well informed about what's happening here right now and what's happening on the ground. I will keep it short. I would like to encourage everyone, on the one hand, to be careful with your own attention economy and not just read about things that are happening out there in the world so you can be like, well, yes, the Americans, but to pay attention to the things that are happening here, both the good and the bad. You said use Signal. Just to speak very practically, find an initiative that you want to be involved in and where you put your energy in your town, in your local area, in your county. Like to find an initiative where we are all on the internet all the time. You can find one where you can say, well, this is an organization that I want to support with my time, with my money. And there's also like this this negative cycle where we hear less, then we maybe deregister from the newsletter, and then there's also this just deep exhaustion with all these crises, which I totally understand. But yeah, if not now, then when, right? Like, get involved, go there, be there on the ground. And just to very briefly about politics, we as civil society who are under an incredible amount of pressure and who experience all of this repression every day and who now try to solve this big problem, but like this task is really this ball is really in the court of professional politicians, and to deal with and to defend democracy even when it's uncomfortable. But there's also like a deep problem where we're like in a crisis of hope, where so many people think like, oh, it's just all completely pointless, everything is lost, there's nothing that we can do anymore. And so we're speaking in a space, and to say this in a space with lots of privileged people who are incredibly networked, probably have some kind of reach speaking to you. Talk about what you do. Talk about good conversations that you've had. Talk about things that really recently inspired you. Talk about events, initiatives, like actions that you know of, and encourage others to go with you, because all of this isn't just about mistrust in institutions, but also like this idea of like our own powerlessness. And we can do something against that, like every one of us, every single day. We don't have enough time to do a full round on this last question, and so I decided to do it differently. So every person in this room has a direct MP in Parliament that you can send an email, and you can ask them to support like this or that, and you can ask them for a response on what they did for that, and if yes, and how or why. So what are the things that you would recommend people like ask their MPs for? Do you have any ideas? Legal certainty for non-profit status and non-profit status for journalism. Astrid gives a thumbs up, so we'll leave it with that. I mean, we can maybe collect I think we can survive 2.5 more minutes. Can we? I mean, the law for the support of democracy. Yeah, totally. Political education. Political education about racism. This whole thing about all of this hate against Muslims, Jews. We need political education. We need this law for the support of democracy, and we need to have a very, very keen eye and keep a very close watch in that regard. The program Living Democracy, continuing and expanding it. So many initiatives depend on that. And countering disinformation, but all the plans so far are just incredibly vague. And the organization that has to deal with that and is responsible for that is incredibly understaffed. And I would just like to add supporting movements, organizations, especially when they're uncomfortable, because that's their job. And if you feel insulted as a politician because you weren't invited to like one demonstration or a protest, I mean, I would argue that there are tons of politicians in government and parliament who constantly reject various invites. And I've also heard that there were politicians who rejected invitations from Republica. So I would always say go into those conversations. And I would just like to add, as small d Democrats, please work together, please collaborate. If you have questions after this, you can go to the Campact stall. Astrid and Luisa will be there for a Q&A session, and we'll be open for comments. So now just another round of applause, please, from everyone, because today you all had open ears for civil society.